Amelia Dyer might just hold the record as Britain's most deadly serial killer, though she's hardly a household name. Born Amelia Elizabeth Hobley in 1837 outside Bristol, she started life in a completely normal family. Her childhood wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows though, especially when her mother caught typhus and spiraled into severe mental illness. Young Amelia became her caretaker until her mother's death in 1848, which scattered the family to the winds. By 1861, she'd married George Thomas, a guy 35 years older than her. They had a child together before Thomas died in 1869, leaving Amelia suddenly widowed with a young kid and desperately needing income. During her marriage, she trained as a nurse and learned about baby farming from a midwife, but Dyer twisted this knowledge into something horrifically profitable. She placed advertisements in local papers calling herself a highly respectable married woman who'd provide safe, loving homes for unwanted children. The catch: she demanded massive upfront payments, sometimes as much as £80, which equals about £8,000 or $10,080 today. But instead of using that money to care for the babies like she promised, Dyer realized she could pocket every penny and simply get rid of the children. At first, her method was brutally simple neglect and starvation. She'd dose the babies with Mother's Friend, an opium-laced syrup meant to calm crying infants, but she used it to overdose them. The babies would suffer through starvation while being heavily sedated until they died. This went on for years until 1879, when a doctor got suspicious about the sheer number of baby deaths he was being called to report at Dyer's home. The doctor reported her to authorities, but instead of facing murder charges, Dyer only got 6 months of hard labor for neglect. Talk about getting off easy for mass murder. But this brush with the law taught her valuable lessons about avoiding detection. When she got out, Dyer immediately went back to baby farming, but with major upgrades to her killing methods. She'd realized that involving doctors and coroners was her biggest mistake, so she stopped calling them entirely. Instead, she developed a signature killing technique using white edging tape to strangle the babies. This was faster, quieter, and left no medical paper trail. Dyer became a master of evasion, constantly relocating to different towns and adopting new identities with each move. She used aliases like Mrs. Thomas to throw police off her trail and avoid desperate parents trying to track down their children. She'd wrap the tiny bodies in linen and newspaper, then dump them in rivers, completely eliminating any evidence. The truly chilling part is the sheer scale of her operation. Eyewitnesses later reported seeing her take in as many as 6 babies per day during her most active periods. Over nearly 30 years of baby farming, experts estimate she could have murdered between 200 and 400 children. That's more than most serial killers kill in their entire careers, and she was doing it as a business model. Dyer also displayed what many believed were convenient bouts of mental illness. She'd attempt suicide and check herself into mental hospitals, especially when police were getting close. Once, she even tried to overdose on opium, but her high tolerance from years of abuse actually saved her life. Many experts think these mental breakdowns were completely fake, timed perfectly to avoid prosecution. Her reign of terror finally ended in March 1896 when a bargeman fishing on the Thames pulled up a parcel containing a decomposing baby girl wrapped in linen and paper. Around her neck was that telltale white edging tape. A sharp police officer noticed a faded name on the paper, Mrs. Thomas, along with a reading address that led straight to Dyer. Police couldn't immediately prove the connection, so they set up an elaborate sting operation. They used a young woman as a decoy who contacted Dyer pretending to be a new mother needing baby farming services. When Dyer showed up to the meeting, she walked straight into a police ambush. Searching her home, officers were hit by the unmistakable stench of human decomposition, even though they found no actual bodies. They discovered white edging tape identical to what was around the baby's neck, telegrams about adoption arrangements, and heartbreaking letters from mothers asking about their children. Police arrested Dyer on April 3, 1896. The Thames was dredged, revealing 6 more tiny bodies, all strangled with white tape around their necks. When confronted with the evidence, Dyer casually told police, "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks," as if she was discussing a hobby rather than mass murder. Her trial in May 1896 was swift and decisive. Dyer pleaded guilty to only 1 murder and tried to claim insanity as her defense, pointing to her various asylum stays. The prosecution argued that her mental illness episodes were nothing but calculated performances to avoid suspicion, and the jury agreed completely. It took them exactly 4.5 minutes to find her guilty. When asked on the scaffold if she had any final words before her execution on June 10, 1896, at exactly 9 in the morning, Dyer simply said, "I have nothing to say." The Amelia Dyer case caused such a massive scandal that she earned the nickname the Ogress of Reading, and inspired popular ballads mocking her crimes. More importantly, her case sparked major child protection reforms, including the Infant Life Protection Act of 1897 and the Children's Act of 1908, which essentially ended the baby farming trade and strengthened adoption regulations. Wanetta Hoyt's story starts in the 1960s when she seemed like the unluckiest mother in the world. Born Wanetta Nixon on May 13, 1946 in rural Richford, New York, she dropped out of Newark Valley High School in 10th grade to marry 19-year-old Tim Hoyt on January 11, 1964. They were young and hopeful, but their dreams of a happy family turned into an absolute nightmare. Between October 17, 1964 and July 28, 1971, Wanetta would give birth to 5 children, and every single one of them died before reaching 29 months old. First came baby Eric in October 1964, but he'd be dead by January 26, 1965 at just 3 months old. The devastated parents told doctors they'd found him barely breathing in his crib and couldn't revive him. 2 years later came James on May 31, 1966, and he made it to 2 years old before calling out after breakfast one morning and suddenly dying on September 26, 1968. Then there was little Julie, born July 19, 1968, who only lived 48 days before choking and turning blue while Wanetta was feeding her on September 5. The family kept trying though, and Molly arrived March 18, 1970. She became the center of groundbreaking medical research when Dr. Alfred Steinschneider at Upstate Medical Center started studying her sleep patterns for potential breathing problems. Molly actually became the first baby in American history to be sent home with an apnea monitor on March 8, 1970. The device was supposed to alert parents if breathing stopped, but it didn't save her life when she died at home on June 5, 1970 at just 3 months old. The final tragedy was Noah, born May 9, 1971. Like his sister Molly, he spent time at Dr. Steinschneider's clinic being monitored for breathing irregularities. Tim Hoyt actually got a vasectomy on July 2, 1971, thinking whatever was killing his children might be hereditary and they shouldn't risk having more babies. But Noah died just weeks later on July 28 at 2 months and 19 days old. Doctors were completely baffled by this string of deaths, and Dr. Steinschneider wrote up the family's case in 1972 as evidence that sudden infant death syndrome could run in families. The medical journal Pediatrics published his research using the Hoyt children as proof that SIDS was hereditary, which influenced medical practice for decades. Wanetta and Tim went on to adopt 2 more children. They temporarily took in Scott in August 1971, but he was removed from their care when Wanetta told her psychiatrist she was afraid she might hurt him. They permanently adopted Jay in 1977, and he survived under their care. For over 20 years, everyone believed the Hoyt family had been struck by an incredibly rare genetic curse. Wanetta kept photos of her dead children throughout their house and placed flowers on their graves every Memorial Day. Friends remember her saying things like, "I miss my children. They all died on me, you know, that crib disease," before breaking into tears. The investigation that would change everything started in 1985 when prosecutor William Fitzpatrick read Dr. Steinschneider's 1972 medical paper while working on a different infanticide case. Medical examiner Linda Norton made a chilling comment when she gave him the article, saying, "When you read this, you may decide you have a serial killer here." Fitzpatrick spent years tracking down the identity of the anonymous family in the paper, eventually connecting them to the Hoyts through medical records. In March 1994, a New York State trooper who knew Juanetta personally approached her for questioning about her children's deaths. During that interrogation, Juanetta made a shocking confession. According to her signed statement, she deliberately suffocated all 5 children because she couldn't stand their crying. She described holding pillows over Eric's and James's faces until they were dead, pressing Julie's face against her shoulder, using a bath towel on Molly, and holding a baby pillow over Noah's face on a hot July day. In her confession, she said, "I feel that if I had got help from counselors, it would have prevented me from killing the rest of my children. I feel that I am a good person, but I know that I did wrong. I loved my children. I cannot go back and undo the wrong that I have done." But almost immediately after confessing, Juanetta recanted her statement and claimed police had coerced her into saying things that weren't true. Her trial in 1995 became a battle between expert witnesses, with forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden testifying that all 5 children had been deliberately suffocated, not killed by SIDS. The prosecution argued that it was statistically impossible for 5 children in one family to die naturally from SIDS, while the defense claimed her confession was obtained through psychological manipulation. Some experts believed interrogators had tricked Juanetta into thinking she was participating in SIDS research rather than being questioned as a murder suspect. On April 22, 1995, the jury found 48-year-old Juanetta Hoyt guilty of murdering all 5 children. As the verdicts were read, nearly all jurors were crying, and even the judge had to pause to control his emotions. She received 15 years to life for each murder count. But here's where the story gets really complicated. Juanetta died of pancreatic cancer in prison on August 13, 1998, before her appeal could be heard. Under New York state law, because her appeal was pending when she died, her conviction was automatically overturned and she was posthumously considered innocent. Modern genetic research has raised serious questions about whether the Hoyt children might have carried a gene mutation called COM2, which can cause sudden death in infants. Similar cases in Australia have shown that SIDS can actually be hereditary, contradicting the medical understanding that existed during Juanetta's trial. Unfortunately, too much time has passed to obtain viable tissue samples that could definitively prove whether genetics played a role in the children's deaths. The Juanetta Hoyt case fundamentally changed how medical professionals and law enforcement approach suspicious infant deaths, leading to stricter protocols for investigating SIDS cases and raising uncomfortable questions about how many other grieving mothers might have been wrongfully convicted of murdering their children. Andrea Yates's childhood and early adult life gave absolutely no hint of the tragedy that would define her forever. She graduated valedictorian of her high school class of 608 students, was captain of the swim team, and president of the National Honor Society. After earning her bachelor's degree in nursing, she became a highly regarded nurse at MD Anderson Hospital in Houston for 8 years before resigning when her first child was born. She married Russell Yates, known as Rusty, a NASA engineer, when she was 29 years old. While Andrea never criticized her husband publicly, her best friend Debbie Holmes described Rusty as controlling, critical, and demanding. Andrea seemed to lose her own identity after marriage and let her husband make all the family decisions, including his plan to have a large family where she'd be a supermom. The couple started their family in 1993 with Noah, followed by John in 1994, Paul in 1995, Luke in February 1999, and finally baby Mary in November 2000. Every witness at Andrea's trial agreed she was an absolutely wonderful mother. She homeschooled all the children because Rusty worried they might pick up bad habits in public school. For every holiday, Andrea handmade crafts and costumes to recreate the original holiday experience for her children. But after Luke's birth in February 1999, Andrea began showing serious signs of mental illness. She felt completely overwhelmed and depressed, and developed the terrifying belief through a feeling that Satan wanted her to kill her children. Instead of harming them, she tried to kill herself on June 18, 1999 by overdosing on medication, leading to her first psychiatric hospitalization. Just 5 weeks later, she attempted to cut her throat and had to be hospitalized again from July 26 to August 10, where doctors diagnosed her with major depressive episode, severe, recurrent, with psychotic features. Despite her psychiatrist's strong warnings about the high risk of postpartum depression returning, Andrea and Rusty decided to have another baby anyway. After Mary's birth in November 2000, Andrea's mental health deteriorated even more dramatically. She had 2 additional psychiatric hospitalizations in March and May 2001. The 4th hospitalization happened after Andrea filled the bathtub at 4 in the afternoon and couldn't explain why except to say I might need it. During her final hospital stay from May 4th to 14th, 2001, Andrea was almost catatonic, barely speaking, eating, or drinking. She acknowledged having suicidal thoughts and obsessed over not being a good mother. Doctors treated her with antipsychotic and antidepressant medications, but her psychiatrist discontinued the antipsychotic medication on June 4 due to side effects, keeping her only on an antidepressant. In the 5 weeks between Andrea's hospital discharge and the murders, she experienced severe psychotic symptoms that she hid from everyone. She believed television commercials were speaking directly to her, calling her a fat pig for giving her children too much candy. She developed the delusional belief that television cameras were placed throughout her home to monitor her mothering, and that her mother-in-law was part of the surveillance with a camera hidden in her glasses. She thought her house was bugged because she saw a van near their home. Most terrifyingly, Andrea believed that Satan was literally within her body and would use any information against her to force her to kill her children. She came to believe her children were not developing right intellectually and weren't righteous. In her delusional state, she thought Luke would become a mute homosexual prostitute, John would become a serial murderer, Noah would die tragically, Paul would be hit by a truck, and all of them would burn in hell because of her defective mothering. Andrea fixated on a biblical verse from Luke 17, verse 2 about it being better for someone to have a millstone hung around their neck and be thrown into the sea rather than cause little ones to stumble. She struggled back and forth in her mind for 1 to 2 months about whether to take her children's lives. On June 20, 2001, Rusty left for work around 9 in the morning and Andrea's mother-in-law wasn't expected until 10. Between those times, Andrea systematically drowned all 5 children in the bathtub. She drowned them in no particular order, then placed each dead child on the double bed in the master bedroom. She positioned baby Mary in the crook of John's arm so he could protect her in the afterlife because John had been such a good big brother. 7-year-old Noah was the most difficult to drown because he was the strongest. He managed to get his head above water and said "I'm sorry, Mommy" before she held him under until he died. She left Noah in the bathtub and arranged the other 4 on the bed. After drowning all 5 children, Andrea called 911 requesting that a police officer be sent to her home. She then called Rusty and simply said it's time, referring to the biblical prophecy in Revelations about Armageddon. When police arrived, Andrea told them I killed my kids and led them to the room with her 4 dead children. Andrea believed that after drowning her children, she would be arrested and executed, which would also kill Satan who was within her. She thought it was right to drown her children because she wanted to save their souls and didn't want them to be in Satan's hands. In her delusional mind, she believed her children had to die to be saved. Her first trial in 2002 ended with a guilty verdict and life sentence after the jury deliberated for only 3.5 hours. However, the conviction was overturned because the prosecution's psychiatric expert, Dr. Park Dietz, made a false statement about a Law and Order episode that influenced the jury. At her retrial in 2006, A jury that wasn't death qualified found Andrea not guilty by reason of insanity after 12 hours of deliberation. The jury foreman explained that they understood she knew drowning was legally wrong, but in her delusional mind, they believed she thought what she did was right. Since January 2007, Andrea has been at Kerrville State Hospital in Texas. Though she's eligible for annual reviews to potentially be released, she chooses every year to waive that right and continue treatment. Her defense attorney says she's happy in the facility and spends her time making crafts that she sells anonymously, with proceeds going to the Yates Children Memorial Fund for women's mental health. She grieves for her children every day, often watching home videos of the kids she killed. Susan Smith was 23 years old, living in the small mill town of Union, South Carolina, when she decided to permanently solve her boyfriend problem by getting rid of what she saw as the biggest obstacle to her happiness. Born Susan Lee Vaughn in 1971, she had what most people would call a troubled childhood that started going downhill when her father committed suicide when she was just 6 years old. Things got even worse when her mother remarried Beverly Russell, who would later become the head of Union County's Christian Coalition. Susan seemed like a normal teenager on the surface, but she was already showing signs of severe emotional distress and even attempted suicide during high school. After graduation, Susan married David Smith in 1991 when she was 19, and they had 2 adorable little boys together. First came Michael on October 21, 1991, and then Alexander arrived on August 5, 1993. By all accounts, Susan appeared to be a loving mother who doted on her children, but behind closed doors, her marriage was falling apart. In September 1994, Susan filed for divorce from David, claiming he'd cheated on her, though David later said Susan was the one having an affair. She'd already set her sights on Tom Findley, a 27-year-old Auburn University graduate who worked as a graphics manager at the textile company where Susan was a secretary. Tom wasn't just any regular guy though, he was the son of the company owner, lived in his family's mansion, and was considered the most eligible bachelor in the entire county. Susan became completely obsessed with Tom and saw him as her ticket to a better life filled with wealth and status. They started dating while she was still married to David, and Susan was convinced they'd have this amazing future together once her divorce was finalized. But there was one major problem that Susan couldn't ignore. Tom made it crystal clear that while he enjoyed their relationship, he absolutely did not want children and wasn't ready to be a stepfather to Michael and Alex. Susan's friend told investigators about a letter Tom had written to Susan that basically ended their relationship because of the kids. In the letter, Tom explained that although he cared about Susan, he simply wasn't prepared to take on the responsibility of raising someone else's children. This letter would later become crucial evidence because it established Susan's motive for what happened next. On October 25, 1994 at around 9 in the evening, Susan strapped 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander into their car seats and drove to John D. Long Lake, which was about 5 miles from her home. According to her later confession, she'd been driving around with the boys for over an hour, wrestling with what she was planning to do. She pulled onto the boat ramp access road, let the car roll toward the water, then stopped it by pulling the emergency brake. Susan got out of the car, walked around to release the brake, and watched as her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protege rolled down the ramp and disappeared into the dark water with her children still strapped inside. Instead of calling for help or trying to save her sons, Susan drove to a nearby house on Lockhart Highway where she knocked on the door at 9:02 in the evening, hysterical and claiming she'd been carjacked. She told homeowner Rick McLeod and the responding police officers that an African-American man wearing a knit cap and plaid jacket had jumped into her car at a red light, forced her to drive several miles at gunpoint, then pushed her out and drove away with Michael and Alex still in the back seat. For 9 agonizing days, Susan played the role of devastated mother perfectly, appearing on television multiple times to make tearful pleas for her children's safe return. She told the cameras, "You guys have got to be so strong. I just feel in my heart that you're okay, but you got to take care of each other," while knowing full well that her children were dead at the bottom of the lake. Her husband David believed her story completely and joined her in making public appeals, begging the supposed kidnapper to return their boys safely. The case became a national sensation, with volunteers organizing massive search efforts both on the ground and from the air. America's Most Wanted featured the story, and tips poured in from all over the country as people tried to help find Michael and Alex. The entire community of Union rallied around the grieving parents, never suspecting that one of them was lying about everything. But behind the scenes, investigators were immediately suspicious of Susan's story because it contained several glaring inconsistencies. The biggest red flag was her claim about being stopped at a red light when the carjacker appeared, because that particular traffic light was only triggered when cars approached from the opposite direction. Since Susan said there were no other vehicles around, the light wouldn't have turned red for her in the first place. Police also discovered that Susan claimed to be visiting Mitch Sinclair that night, but he wasn't expecting her and wasn't even home. She also lied about taking the children to Walmart earlier that day, and when investigators checked, no one remembered seeing them there. Susan failed 2 polygraph tests, with results that strongly suggested she was being deceptive about knowing where her children were located. On November 3rd, after 9 days of intensive questioning, Susan finally cracked during an interrogation with Sheriff Howard Wells. She broke down crying and admitted that her children weren't all right, then told investigators they'd find the car and bodies at the bottom of John D. Long Lake. Divers immediately went to the location and found the burgundy Mazda 122 feet from the boat ramp under 18 feet of water. When they pulled the car up, Michael and Alex were still strapped in their car seats, and investigators could see their small hands pressed against the windows. In her written confession, Susan claimed she'd originally planned to kill herself along with the children because she didn't want them to grow up without a mother. She said she was suicidal and wasn't thinking clearly that night. However, prosecutors argued that her real motive was much more calculated. She wanted Tom Findlay back and saw her children as the only obstacle preventing that relationship. Susan's trial began in July 1995 and became a media circus. Though unlike the O.J. Simpson trial happening at the same time, cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom. The prosecution presented a reenactment video showing the car slowly sinking into the lake from the children's perspective, revealing that it took a full 6 minutes for the water to reach Michael and Alex, giving Susan plenty of time to save them if she'd wanted to. During the penalty phase, Susan's defense team revealed that her stepfather Beverly Russell had been sexually abusing her since she was 15 years old and continued the abuse throughout her marriage up until just 3 months before the murders. This bombshell testimony was meant to explain Susan's psychological state and convince the jury to spare her life. The jury found Susan guilty after just 2.5 hours of deliberation. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, even convincing David Smith to testify that he preferred execution over life imprisonment because under South Carolina law, Susan would be eligible for parole after serving 20 to 30 years. However, after another 2.5 hours, the jury unanimously decided to sentence Susan to life in prison instead. Susan hasn't been a model prisoner during her 30 years behind bars. Prison records show she's had sexual encounters with 2 different guards, both of whom lost their jobs and faced criminal charges. She's also been sanctioned for drug violations and self-mutilation. In 2015, Susan wrote a letter to a South Carolina newspaper claiming she wasn't in her right mind the night she killed Michael and Alexander. On November 20, 2024, exactly 30 years after drowning her children, Susan appeared before a parole board asking for her freedom. Her ex-husband David, who has since remarried and had 2 more children, attended the hearing to oppose her release. The parole board unanimously denied her request, meaning Susan will remain in prison for at least 2 more years before she can ask for parole again. Darlie Lynn Peck Routier seemed to have everything going for her in the mid-1990s when she and her husband Darren lived the perfect suburban life in Rowlett, Texas with their 3 young children. Born on January 4, 1970 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, 26-year-old Darlie was a homemaker raising 6-year-old Devon, 5-year-old Damon, and 7-month-old Drake in their upscale neighborhood 20 miles east of downtown Dallas. The Routiers had built their dream house at the end of Eagle Drive, complete with a beautiful front yard where the boys could play safely. On the night of June 5, 1996, Darlie decided to sleep downstairs on the couch with Devin and Damon because baby Drake had kept her awake the night before. Darren took Drake upstairs to bed around 10:30 in the evening while Darlie settled down with the boys on blankets spread across the family room floor. Around 10:30 that night, they'd all been watching television together before the children fell asleep. Just before 2:30 in the morning on June 6, Darlie claimed she was awakened by 5-year-old Damon shaking her shoulder and saying, "Mommy, Mommy." According to her story, she sat up and saw a blur of a man going out through her utility room. She walked into the kitchen, turned on the lights, and noticed blood on the front of her nightgown. Darlie said she saw a knife lying on the utility room floor and instinctively picked it up before setting it on the kitchen counter. When she turned around, Darlie discovered 6-year-old Devin lying across the room on his back with his eyes open. She immediately started screaming, which brought Darren running downstairs from the master bedroom. They called 911 within minutes, and police arrived at their house in less than 3 minutes. The scene that greeted first responders was absolutely horrific. Devin was already dead from multiple stab wounds to his chest. 5-year-old Damon was still clinging to life but died shortly after being rushed to Presbyterian Hospital. Both boys had been stabbed with what appeared to be a large kitchen knife. The murder weapon turned out to be an 8-inch butcher knife that came from the Routiers' own kitchen. Darlie herself had suffered serious injuries during the attack. She had a deep gash across her neck from one side to the other that missed her carotid artery by just millimeters. She also had 2 stab wounds on her right forearm and extensive bruising covering her arms from wrist to elbow. These injuries required immediate surgery, and doctors said the neck wound could easily have been fatal if it had been just slightly deeper. Police initially treated the case as a home invasion gone wrong and searched the house for any signs of an intruder. In the garage, they discovered that the window screen had been cut in a peculiar T-shaped pattern. Officers quickly secured the house and surrounding area, looking for any evidence of the supposed attacker who had fled the scene. But crime scene consultant Jim Cron, who had investigated more than 4,000 murders during his career, immediately became suspicious when he arrived at 6 in the morning. The cut in the garage window screen looked completely wrong to him because it created a narrow opening that would have been difficult for an intruder to squeeze through. He also couldn't understand why a burglar would ignore expensive jewelry sitting right on the kitchen counter and instead attack sleeping children first. Even more puzzling was the fact that the murderer had apparently searched for a weapon inside the house instead of bringing their own. During the 911 call, Darlie seemed more concerned about having touched the knife and ruining it for fingerprints than about her children bleeding to death at her feet. Cron later said this behavior was typical of crime scene stagers who try to explain away evidence in advance. Detective Jimmy Patterson was shocked when he questioned Darlie after her surgery because she never asked about her children's condition. He found it extremely odd that someone who had supposedly fought face-to-face with an intruder couldn't provide any description of the attacker's appearance. Darlie claimed she couldn't remember what the man looked like despite wrestling with him for her life. The blood evidence at the scene raised even more red flags for investigators. There was no blood on the edge of the couch where Darlie claimed she'd been attacked and injured. She said she'd chased the intruder into the utility room, but her bloody footprints only went part way through the kitchen before stopping. When crime scene investigator Lieutenant David Neighbors used luminol to reveal hidden blood traces, he discovered something that stunned him in his 18-year career. The chemical revealed massive amounts of blood in and around the kitchen sink that had been cleaned up and washed away. Neighbors had never seen anything like it and believed it indicated that someone had stood over the sink cleaning blood off themselves after the attacks. This discovery supported the theory that Darlie had murdered her children and then slit her own throat while standing at the sink. During questioning, Darlie's story changed 3 different times regarding the intruder's position and movements. Detective Patterson said that while some details might be fuzzy after trauma, a victim would always remember exactly where their attacker was located. Police also found it suspicious that there was no evidence anyone had climbed over the 6-foot backyard fence or gone through the difficult-to-open gate. The one piece of evidence that seemed to support Darley's intruder theory was a bloody sock found 75 yards away in an alley behind their house. DNA testing later proved the blood belonged to Devon and Damon. Defense attorneys argued this sock proved an intruder had murdered the boys and escaped down the alley. But investigators believed Darley had planted the sock herself as part of staging the crime scene, along with overturning a vacuum cleaner and breaking a wine glass to simulate a struggle. 8 days after the murders, local news cameras captured footage that would become crucial evidence against Darley. The video showed her at the cemetery celebrating what would have been Devon's 7th birthday by spraying silly string on his grave while laughing and chewing gum. Prosecutor Greg Davis later described watching a mother literally dancing on her children's graves just over a week after their brutal murders. Darley claimed she was honoring Devon's memory because he'd wanted to turn 7, but the jury watched this video 7 times during her trial. Juror Charlie Samford said he saw no grief in her behavior and that she appeared to be enjoying herself rather than mourning. This footage became one of the most damaging pieces of evidence against her. On June 18, 1996, exactly 12 days after the murders, Rowlett police arrested 26-year-old Darley Routier and charged her with capital murder. She was specifically charged with killing Damon, though prosecutors also planned to try her for Devon's murder later. After a change of venue to Kerrville, Texas, her trial began in January 1997. The prosecution argued that Darley had murdered her children because of financial stress, then staged the crime scene and injured herself to cover up the murders. They presented evidence showing her injuries were self-inflicted and that no intruder had ever entered the house. The defense maintained there was no motive, no confession, and no witnesses to prove Darley's guilt. On February 1, 1997, after deliberating, the jury found Darley guilty of capital murder and sentenced her to death by lethal injection. She was 27 years old when she arrived on death row at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Darley has never been tried for Devon's murder because prosecutors felt the death sentence for Damon's murder was sufficient. Since her conviction, Darley has filed multiple appeals based on allegations of trial irregularities, but courts have consistently denied them. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld her conviction and death sentence in May 2003. However, her case has gained new attention due to advances in DNA technology. In April 2021, the Innocence Project joined Darley's legal team and successfully petitioned for additional DNA testing of evidence from the crime scene. Judge Audra Riley ordered multiple agencies to send evidence to a California laboratory for advanced testing, including the bloody sock, hair samples, Darley's nightgown, and fingernail clippings from the children. Defense attorneys are particularly interested in Y chromosome DNA found on several items that appears to belong to an unknown male. Darley remains on death row in Texas, still maintaining her innocence after nearly 30 years. Her ex-husband Darren continues to believe she's innocent and has never wavered in his support. The case has inspired multiple books, documentaries, and television shows, with public opinion remaining divided on whether Darley Routier is a grieving mother or a cold-blooded killer. Dominique Cartrez lived what appeared to be an absolutely normal life in the quiet village of Villers-Tertry in northern France, working as a nursing assistant while her husband Pierre-Marie made furniture as a carpenter. Born Dominique Cartrez, she married Pierre-Marie and they settled into village life where he even served on the local council for years. Mayor Patrick Mercier described Pierre-Marie as a decent, well-meaning type, and neighbors considered the Cartrez family to be quiet people without any drama or problems. The couple had 2 daughters together, Emmeline and Virginie, who grew up normally and eventually became mothers themselves in their 20s. Everyone in the village knew Dominique struggled with severe obesity, weighing nearly 330 pounds, but she was well-liked and respected as a healthcare worker. Nobody suspected that behind her friendly exterior, Dominique was hiding one of the most shocking secrets in modern French criminal history. Between 1989 and 2006, Dominique secretly gave birth to 8 babies and suffocated each one immediately after delivery. She managed to hide every single pregnancy from her husband, her co-workers, her friends, and even her own doctor by using her extreme weight to conceal the physical changes. According to prosecutor Eric Valiant, Dominique was able to keep these pregnancies completely secret because of her obesity, which made it impossible for anyone to detect that she was carrying children. The horrifying truth only came to light on July 24, 2010, when new homeowners were doing garden work at a house that had previously belonged to Dominique's deceased parents. While digging in the yard, they discovered the remains of 2 tiny infants buried in plastic bags. The shocked couple immediately called the gendarmes, and police quickly cleared them of any wrongdoing since they'd only recently moved into the property. Investigators immediately focused their attention on the previous residents of the house, which led them straight to Dominique and Pierre-Marie Cotrez. When police brought them in for questioning as witnesses on July 27, Dominique shocked everyone by immediately confessing that the 2 dead babies belonged to her. But her confession didn't stop there. She calmly told investigators that they'd find 6 more infant corpses hidden in plastic bags inside her garage at their current home. Police rushed to the Cotrez house and discovered exactly what Dominique had described: 6 more tiny bodies stored in plastic bags in their garage. All 8 infants had been suffocated shortly after birth, and Dominique had been storing some of the bodies for over 20 years. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small village of Villers-aux-Tertrais, where residents lit 8 candles in front of what became known as the House of Horror. During her initial interrogation, Dominique explained to investigators that she decided never to have more children after experiencing what she called trauma during the births of her 2 daughters. According to prosecutor Valiant, hospital staff had criticized and ridiculed Dominique about her weight during those earlier deliveries, which created deep psychological scars. She refused to consult doctors about contraception, either from timidity or religious conviction, depending on conflicting media reports. Each time Dominique became pregnant after her daughters were born, she would secretly carry the baby to full term without anyone knowing. When labor began, she'd give birth alone, then immediately suffocate the newborn and hide the body. She buried some babies in her parents' garden and stored others in plastic bags in various locations around her own property. This pattern continued for 17 years without her husband Pierre-Marie having any clue what was happening. Pierre-Marie told investigators that his whole world turned upside down when he learned the truth about his wife's secret murders. He swore he never knew Dominique was pregnant during any of those 8 occasions and had no knowledge that she was killing and hiding babies. Prosecutor Valiant believed Pierre-Marie was completely innocent, saying investigators were convinced of his ignorance about the infanticides. Pierre-Marie was initially detained on suspicion of failing to report crimes, but police released him without charges after concluding he was genuinely unaware of his wife's actions. For over 4 years after her arrest, Dominique maintained a completely fabricated story about why she'd killed her children. She convinced police investigators, psychiatric experts, judges, and lawyers that she'd been sexually abused by her father as a child and continued having an incestuous relationship with him throughout her marriage. She claimed she killed the babies because she feared they were products of incest with her deceased father. This elaborate lie successfully delayed her trial and generated sympathy from mental health professionals who believed her trauma explained the infanticides. The truth finally came out during her trial in June 2015 when Dominique admitted in court that she'd never been raped or abused by her father. Her lawyers confirmed that she confessed to making up the entire incest story, meaning she'd spent years lying to everyone about her motives for murdering 8 newborn babies. This revelation completely changed how prosecutors and the public viewed her case, transforming her from a victim of childhood trauma into a cold-blooded killer who'd manipulated the legal system. During the dramatic trial in the northern city of Douai, Dominique's 2 adult daughters, 28-year-old Emmeline and 27-year-old Virginie, begged the court not to send their mother back to prison. They'd already lost their father's trust and their family's reputation, and they desperately wanted to rebuild their relationship with Dominique. Both daughters had children of their own, making the case even more emotionally complex for the family. Prosecutors originally sought an 18-year prison sentence for Dominique, arguing that she'd committed voluntary murder of 8 defenseless infants. However, prosecutor Eric Valiant asked the court to consider extenuating circumstances because psychiatric evaluations showed Dominique suffered from severe psychological problems and neuroses. The prosecution acknowledged that while her crimes were horrific, her mental state was clearly impaired during the period when she was killing her babies. On July 2, 2015, after deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found 51-year-old Dominique Cotres guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder for the first baby she killed in 1989. However, they decided her judgment was significantly impaired at the time of the killings and sentenced her to only 9 years in prison, exactly half of what prosecutors had requested. Since Dominique had already spent 2 years in prison awaiting trial and was released in 2012, she only had to serve a few more years to complete her sentence. Her lawyer Frank Burton said she expressed satisfaction and relief at being heard and understood for the first time, plus the possibility of finally getting psychological help. The case became known as the worst infanticide case in modern French history and raised serious questions about mental health support for mothers struggling with psychological disorders. Leanne Smith seemed to be living her dream life in the sunny Spanish coastal town of Lloret de Mar until it turned into the worst nightmare imaginable in May 2010. Originally from Wallsend, Tyne and Wear, the 44-year-old former child protection worker had been living on the run in Spain since 2007 with a partner Martin Smith and their 2 children, 5-year-old Rebecca and 11-month-old Daniel. They'd fled the UK after Martin Smith had been accused of sexually abusing Leanne's eldest daughter Sarah from her previous marriage. The couple had been leading a quiet double life in Barcelona, with Leanne using the false name Ross and working as an English teacher while claiming to be married to a writer who never left the house. Rebecca attended school in the city's Horta neighborhood and baby Daniel went to daycare, creating the illusion of a perfectly normal family. They moved between 3 different apartments and behaved like any other young couple with children, trying desperately to leave their troubled past behind. But their carefully constructed new life came crashing down in early 2010 when their Barcelona home was burglarized. When they reported the break-in to Spanish police, authorities quickly discovered there was an international arrest warrant for Martin Smith. From that moment, Leanne became increasingly paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder and convinced she was being watched by British authorities who wanted to take her children away. Her worst fears became reality just days later when Spanish police arrested Martin Smith and extradited him to the UK to face charges of repeatedly raping his stepdaughter between 1995 and 2004. After Martin's arrest, Leanne was left alone with Rebecca and Daniel, completely convinced that British social services were coming to Spain to seize her children and put them into care. This belief triggered a psychological breakdown that would lead to unthinkable tragedy. Instead of fighting the system or seeking help, Leanne made the horrific decision that she'd rather murder her children than let them be taken away from her. On May 14, 2010, she packed a few clothes and took Rebecca and Daniel to the 4-star Hotel Miramar in Lloret de Mar, a seaside resort where they'd stayed previously. She told hotel staff she was on vacation with her children, but police later discovered she'd come there with absolutely no intention of leaving alive. For 3 days, Leanne gave her unsuspecting children what she later described as the perfect weekend. She took them to the beach, bought them treats, and played with them like any loving mother would during a special holiday. Rebecca and Daniel had no idea their mother was planning to end their lives along with her own. Leanne later told investigators that she wanted their final days to be filled with happiness and love. On the evening of May 17, around 9 in the evening, Leanne entered the adjoining hotel room where Rebecca and Daniel were sleeping peacefully in their beds. She systematically sat on each child to prevent them from moving, then placed plastic bags over their heads and held them there until they suffocated. The murders were calculated and deliberate, carried out while the children were helpless and trusting. After killing both children, Leanne spent the entire night lying beside their lifeless bodies, writing suicide notes and trying unsuccessfully to take her own life using the same suffocation method she'd used on Rebecca and Daniel. Police found 4 notes she'd written, including one addressed directly to her dead children that read, "I love you very much. I haven't been able to give you a marvelous life together. I am so sorry." Most of her other writings focused on defending Martin Smith's innocence. The next afternoon around 2:30 in the afternoon on May 18, Leanne calmly walked down to the hotel reception desk and asked staff to call the police. When officers arrived, they found her sitting on the brown bedspread in room 101, speaking in what investigating officer Josep Montes later described as slow motion, as though she were on another planet. She immediately confessed to the murders, telling police, "My intention was to go, my children and me, together while pointing toward heaven." Police found Rebecca and Daniel tucked into their beds in the adjoining room, positioned as though they were simply sleeping. The scene was so peaceful that officers initially thought the children might still be alive. Leanne's confession was recorded on video at the hotel, where she explained in chilling detail how she'd killed her children because she knew they couldn't defend themselves. During her trial at the provincial court in Girona in June 2012, Leanne's defense team argued she was psychiatrically disturbed and not criminally responsible for her actions. They claimed she was suffering from insurmountable fear when the tragedy happened and was in a state of complete psychological breakdown. Psychiatrist Harry Barker, who treated her in Girona prison, testified that Leanne told him she'd asked 5-year-old Rebecca whether she'd prefer to live a few very happy days with her mother or a long time without her, and Rebecca had replied she wanted to stay with her mother. However, the jury unanimously rejected the insanity defense after 8 hours of deliberation. They ruled that Leanne was fully conscious of what she had done and that it was wrong, adding that she took advantage of the trust the children gave her as their mother. On June 20, 2012, 45-year-old Leanne Smith was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. Prosecutor Victor Palado Quintas described the crimes as abominable and requested a sentence of 34 years in prison. But on July 2, 2012, Judge Adolfo Garcia Morales sentenced Leanne to 30 years, taking into account her confession and psychological state. She remained expressionless throughout the sentencing, showing no emotion as her fate was sealed. The tragic case destroyed multiple families beyond just Rebecca and Daniel's deaths. Leanne's 21-year-old son Chris from her first marriage told reporters that his mother's conviction ended his worst nightmare, but said he would never forgive her for what she'd done. He hadn't seen his mother for 5 years after she abandoned him in 2007 when his sister Sarah reported Martin Smith's abuse. Rebecca and Daniel were buried in a cemetery in Lloret de Mar because their grandparents couldn't afford to have the bodies repatriated to England. The case became even more tragic when Martin Smith, who'd been sentenced to 16 years in prison for sexually abusing his stepdaughter, was found hanged in his cell at HMP Manchester in January 2012. He died just months before Leanne's trial, never living to see the full consequences of his actions that had triggered this horrific chain of events. Leanne remains in Spanish prison serving her 30-year sentence for the murders of her innocent children. Megan Huntsman looked like any other suburban mom living with her 3 daughters in the quiet Mormon community of Pleasant Grove, Utah, but over a 10-year period she harbored one of the most shocking secrets in modern American crime history. Born on February 26, 1975, Megan grew up as the oldest child of an industrial painter father and a mother who worked various jobs including at a grocery store. She was raised in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints but wasn't actively practicing by the time of her arrest, according to family members. Megan met her future husband Darren West during high school at Pleasant Grove High, and they got married in April 1993 just after she turned 18. What started as a typical young Mormon marriage slowly deteriorated into a cycle of substance abuse, domestic violence, and drug-related criminal behavior. Darren eventually became so addicted to methamphetamine that he was convicted on drug charges and spent 8 years in prison from 2006 to 2014. While Darren was behind bars, Megan continued living in his parents' house at 523 East 200 North in Pleasant Grove with their 3 daughters, who were completely unaware of what their mother had done in that very same house years earlier. Between 1996 and 2006, during the worst periods of her methamphetamine addiction, Megan had secretly given birth to 6 babies and murdered each one immediately after delivery. According to police investigators, Megan would give birth to these babies alone in the house, then strangle or suffocate them within minutes of their arrival. She told detectives she used various methods including her bare hands, and in at least one case, a hair tie to make sure the baby was dead. After killing each infant, she'd wrap their tiny bodies in towels or shirts, place them inside plastic bags, and then seal them in cardboard boxes before storing them in the garage. Captain Mike Roberts of the Pleasant Grove Police Department said Megan's motive was completely selfish because she was high on drugs and didn't want the babies or the responsibility that came with caring for them. The cost of her methamphetamine habit was also a major factor, as investigators discovered she was spending significant amounts of money on drugs and couldn't afford to support more children. She wasn't concerned about potential health problems her drug use might cause to unborn children because her addiction controlled every decision she made. Megan managed to hide all 6 pregnancies from her family, friends, neighbors, and even her own daughters who were living in the same house. Nobody suspected anything unusual was happening, and she continued working at a local supermarket bakery while maintaining what appeared to be a completely normal existence. Even her closest neighbors described her as someone they trusted to babysit their children, making the eventual discovery even more shocking to the entire community. The horrifying truth only came to light on April 12, 2014, when Darren West was finally released from prison after serving his 8-year sentence. He went to his parents' house where Megan and their daughters had been living to gather his belongings and start cleaning out the garage. While moving several boxes around, Darren discovered a small white container wrapped in plastic and electrician's tape that contained the decomposing remains of a tiny infant. Darren was so horrified by his discovery that he immediately called the police, having absolutely no idea that his ex-wife was responsible for the baby's death. When investigators arrived at the scene, they obtained a search warrant and found 6 more infant bodies hidden throughout the garage, each carefully wrapped and stored in separate cardboard boxes. The smell of chemicals filled the air, indicating that someone had attempted to preserve or hide the decomposition. Police brought Megan in for questioning, and she initially claimed that only one baby had been stillborn and that she'd been too scared to report it to authorities. But as investigators continued finding more bodies, her story completely fell apart. She eventually confessed to killing 6 of the 7 infants, with the 7th being legitimately stillborn according to later autopsy results. During her police interviews, Megan gave chilling details about each murder, describing how she'd strangle or suffocate the newborns immediately after giving birth. Detective Dan Beckstrom later testified that she showed no emotion while recounting these horrific acts and even mentioned using a hair tie to ensure one of the babies was completely dead. DNA testing confirmed that Darren West was the biological father of all 7 children, but he'd been completely unaware of any of the pregnancies or murders. Utah County Attorney Jeff Booman charged Megan with 6 counts of first-degree murder, though the charges had to be filed under the older murder statutes that were in place during the 1996 to 2006 timeframe when the crimes occurred. She was held on $6 million bail while awaiting trial. Prosecutors made it clear they would seek the maximum penalty possible under the law. On February 11, 2015, 39-year-old Megan Huntsman appeared in Utah 4th District Court and pleaded guilty to all 6 murder charges. Her voice broke as she said guilty 6 separate times, once for each baby she'd killed. In a statement read by her attorney, she said depression and alcohol took hold of me the same way drugs did, and that she couldn't give a reasonable answer for why she was capable of such a sick and heinous crime. 2 of Megan's 3 surviving daughters wrote letters of support that were read in court during her sentencing hearing. They were trying to maintain some relationship with their mother despite the unimaginable horror of learning she'd murdered 6 of their siblings. The entire family was devastated by the revelations, and the community of Pleasant Grove struggled to understand how such evil could exist in their quiet neighborhood. On April 20, 2015, Judge Daryl McDade sentenced 40-year-old Megan Huntsman to 6 terms of 5 years to life in prison. 3 of those sentences were ordered to run consecutively while the other 3 would run concurrently, meaning she'd serve at least 30 years before becoming eligible for parole. Judge McDade commented that he thought he'd encountered everything in his career until this case came before his court. Megan's first parole hearing is scheduled for April 2064, when she'll be 89 years old. Prosecutors said she'll likely spend the rest of her natural life behind bars for what they described as one of the most heinous series of crimes they'd ever prosecuted. The case serves as a stark reminder of how addiction and mental illness can lead to unthinkable acts, even from people who appear completely normal on the surface. Tanya Thomas lived in a modest house in Port St. John, Florida, with her 4 children on the scenic Space Coast about 15 miles from Cape Canaveral. At 33 years old, she was raising 17-year-old Pebbles Johnson, 15-year-old Jaxes Johnson, 13-year-old Yaslyn Johnson, and 12-year-old Joel Johnson mostly as a single mother. The kids' father lived separately in nearby Titusville and hadn't been home in several months, leaving Tanya to handle everything on her own. Their household was far from peaceful though, with neighbors frequently hearing shouting and arguments coming from inside the house. In April 2012, just weeks before the tragedy, tensions had reached a boiling point between Tanya and her teenage son Jaxes. According to police reports, 15-year-old Jaxes threw a bicycle through a window and threatened his mother during one violent outburst. The next day, when Tanya tried to wake him for school, Jaxes kicked and punched her repeatedly, which led to them getting into a physical fight. Police were called to the house that day, and neighbors told officers they regularly heard yelling and screaming from the Thomas home. Despite these obvious warning signs of a family in crisis, investigators from the Department of Children and Families had visited Tanya and her children just weeks before the massacre. They spoke with each child individually and concluded there were no signs that any of them were in distress or danger. Each child told the caseworker they felt safe in their Central Florida home, which made what happened next even more shocking to everyone involved in the case. On the morning of May 15, 2012, around 3 in the morning, Tanya sent a chilling text message to a male coworker that read, "Tell my mom what happened. I want to be cremated with my children." Lieutenant Todd Goodyear of the Brevard County Sheriff's Office later said this text message was clear evidence that Tanya had planned the murders in advance rather than acting on impulse. She'd made the decision to kill her children and herself, and was already thinking about funeral arrangements before she even started shooting. Around 4:30 in the morning, neighbors were awakened by the sound of gunfire coming from the Thomas house. Minutes later, 2 of Tanya's children appeared at a neighbor's door, frantically banging and trying to get inside. 12-year-old Joel was covered in blood and told the shocked neighbor that his mom had shot them. The neighbor could see 17-year-old Pebbles walking back toward the family home, apparently injured but still mobile. What happened next was absolutely heartbreaking and showed just how much control Tanya still had over her children even after shooting them. She calmly walked outside and called for her kids to come back home, speaking in a normal tone without seeming stressed or angry. Lieutenant Goodyear later described her demeanor as very calm when she said simply come home to her wounded children. The desperate neighbors called out to the kids, begging them not to go back to the house where their mother was waiting with a gun. Despite being shot and bleeding, all 4 children obeyed their mother's command and walked back toward the house. The neighbor who tried to help them immediately called 911 to report what was happening. Her husband grabbed his own gun but refused to go outside, telling the dispatcher, "I don't know who has the gun, so I'm not walking out there. I'm armed but not going out there and putting myself in danger." He watched helplessly as one bleeding child stood at their front door before returning to Tanya when she called. Police arrived within 4 minutes of the emergency call and immediately heard more gunshots coming from inside the Thomas house. They quickly set up a perimeter around the property and discovered Pebbles lying wounded in the front yard. EMTs rushed her to an ambulance, but she was pronounced dead before they could save her. A SWAT team was called to handle what had become an active shooting situation. While officers surrounded the house, they heard one final gunshot from inside. When the tactical team finally entered the home, they found Tanya dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The other 3 children, Joel, Yaslyn, and Jaxes, were also found dead inside the back of the house. Medical examiners later determined that Tanya had used a Taurus .38 caliber revolver to shoot her children a total of 18 times before killing herself. The autopsy reports revealed the brutal details of how each child died. One child was shot 7 times, while the youngest, 12-year-old Joel, was shot 5 times from more than 2 feet away. Tanya had fired the revolver directly against the chest of at least 2 children, showing the close range and deliberate nature of the murders. There were 19 total gunshot wounds found on all the victims, including Tanya's self-inflicted fatal wound. Investigators later discovered that Tanya had a blood alcohol level that indicated she was drunk when she committed the murders. This added another tragic element to an already devastating case, suggesting that alcohol may have impaired her judgment during those crucial morning hours. Lieutenant Goodyear told reporters that the case was particularly disturbing because the victims were older children rather than infants, and he couldn't remember the last time a mother had killed so many of her own kids. The Thomas family massacre became the worst homicide case in Brevard County since 1987. What made it even more tragic was the fact that 3 of the children had actually escaped and reached safety, but their psychological bond with their mother was so strong that they returned to the house when she called them. Neighbors who witnessed the events were traumatized by watching helplessly as the children walked back to their deaths. Police never found a suicide note or any clear explanation for why Tanya decided to murder her children and herself. Lieutenant Goodyear said the lack of a motive was one of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation, noting that they might never understand what drove her to commit such a horrific act. The case highlighted the complex dynamics of domestic violence and family dysfunction, showing how quickly a troubled household can explode into unthinkable tragedy. The community of Port St. John was left reeling from the murders, struggling to understand how a mother could systematically execute her 4 children. The case became a stark reminder that even when warning signs are present and authorities are involved, some family tragedies can't be prevented once a parent decides to take such drastic action. Tanya Thomas took her reasons to the grave, leaving behind only questions and the devastating loss of 4 young lives. Casey Anthony became one of the most infamous names in America after the disappearance and death of her 2-year-old daughter Kaylee Marie Anthony in Orlando, Florida during the summer of 2008. Born on March 19, 1986, 22-year-old Casey was living with her parents George and Cindy Anthony along with little Kaylee, who'd been born on August 9, 2005. The Anthony household seemed normal on the surface, but underneath there were serious tensions about Casey's parenting style and her reluctance to take full responsibility for raising Kaylee. On June 16, 2008, Casey left the family home with Kaylee and didn't return for 31 days. During this entire month, Casey told her parents various stories about where Kaylee was staying, claiming the toddler was with different babysitters or friends. She continued going to parties, getting tattoos, and acting like a carefree single woman while her daughter was nowhere to be found. Casey even got a tattoo during this period that read Bella Vita, which means beautiful life in Italian. The truth about Kaylee's disappearance only came out when George Anthony went to retrieve Casey's white Pontiac Sunfire from a tow yard on July 15, 2008. Both George and the tow yard manager noticed an overwhelming stench coming from the trunk that smelled like decomposition. That same evening, Cindy Anthony tracked down Casey at her boyfriend's house and demanded to know where Kaylee was. When Casey continued lying about the toddler's whereabouts, Cindy called 911 and told the dispatcher that she hadn't seen her granddaughter for 31 days and that Casey's car smelled like a dead body had been inside it. During that frantic 911 call, Cindy said there's something wrong because she'd found Casey's car and it smelled like there'd been a dead body in the car. When police arrived to question Casey, she told them an elaborate story about how a babysitter named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, nicknamed Zani, had kidnapped Kaylee on June 9. She claimed she'd been conducting her own investigation to find her daughter and hadn't contacted police because Zani had threatened to hurt Kaylee if Casey involved authorities. But Casey's story immediately fell apart under police scrutiny. She claimed she worked at Universal Studios Orlando, so detectives took her there to verify her employment, but security had no record of her ever working there. She also said Zani lived at a specific apartment complex, but when police checked, the apartment had been vacant for months. Even worse, they discovered that no one named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez matching Casey's description existed anywhere. Casey was arrested on July 16, 2008, just one day after Kaylee was reported missing, on charges of child neglect, giving false statements, and obstruction. 4 months, Casey maintained her innocence while sitting in jail, but the case took a tragic turn on December 11, 2008, when a utility worker found Kaylee's skeletal remains in a wooded area just 15 houses away from the Anthony family home. The toddler's skull was found inside a laundry bag along with a blanket, and investigators discovered 3 pieces of duct tape attached to the skull. The medical examiner ruled Kaylee's death a homicide by undetermined means because her remains were too decomposed to determine an exact cause of death. Prosecutors charged Casey with first-degree murder in October 2008 and announced they'd seek the death penalty. They built their case around several key pieces of evidence, including the duct tape found with Kaylee's remains, chloroform searches on the Anthony family computer, and Casey's behavior during the 31 days when Kaylee was missing. Lead prosecutor Jeff Ashton argued that Casey had murdered her daughter using chloroform and duct tape because she wanted to live a party lifestyle without parenting responsibilities. The prosecution's theory was that someone had conducted 84 internet searches for chloroform and how to make chloroform on the Anthony family computer. They claimed Casey had drugged Kaylee with homemade chloroform, then suffocated her by placing 3 pieces of duct tape over her nose and mouth. Prosecutors also pointed to Casey's behavior after Kaylee's death as evidence of guilt, noting that she partied, got tattoos, and lied constantly instead of reporting her daughter missing. However, Casey's defense team, led by attorney Jose Baez, presented a completely different version of events when her trial began in May 2011. Baez argued that Kaylee had accidentally drowned in the Anthony family swimming pool on June 16, 2008, and that George Anthony had discovered the body. The defense claimed George had convinced Casey to help cover up the accidental drowning because he was afraid Casey would be blamed and go to prison. Baez also systematically challenged every piece of the prosecution's evidence during the 6-week trial. He argued that the chloroform searches were innocent curiosity after Casey's boyfriend posted a joke photo online with a chloroform reference. Defense experts testified that chloroform occurs naturally in many household products and could have been in Casey's car trunk for innocent reasons. They also pointed out that toxicology tests on Kaylee's remains found no traces of chloroform or any other drugs. Regarding the duct tape, Baez argued there was no proof it had been placed over Kaylee's mouth and nose while she was alive. He suggested the tape might have been used to secure the garbage bags after Kaylee was already dead, or could have shifted during the months her body was decomposing in the woods. The defense also noted that FBI analysis of the tape revealed no fingerprints and DNA that actually excluded both Casey and Kaylee as the source. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Cindy Anthony testified that she had been the one searching for chloroform on the family computer, not Casey. However, prosecutors quickly demolished this claim by presenting Cindy's work records, which showed she was at her job during the times when the chloroform searches were conducted. This testimony raised questions about whether Cindy could face perjury charges for lying under oath. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for just over 10 hours, the jury shocked the world by finding Casey Anthony not guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter. They convicted her only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. Casey broke down sobbing and hugged her defense team when the verdict was read. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and $4,000 in fines, but was released on July 17, 2011, with credit for time served. The verdict sparked massive public outrage, with polls showing that most Americans believed Casey was guilty of murdering her daughter. Juror Jennifer Ford later explained that while they thought Casey was probably guilty, the prosecution hadn't proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. She said the jury was sick to their stomachs but had no choice except to follow the law and evidence presented to them. After her release, Casey largely disappeared from public view until March 2025, when she joined social media to promote herself as a legal advocate. She launched a Substack newsletter and said she planned to advocate for herself and her late daughter after years of staying silent. The case inspired Kaylee's law in multiple states, making it a felony for parents not to report missing children within a specific time frame. Casey Anthony remains one of the most polarizing figures in recent American criminal history, with public opinion still divided on whether she got away with murder or was wrongfully accused. Kathleen Folbig became known as Australia's most hated woman after she was convicted in 2003 of murdering her 4 infant children in what prosecutors claimed was one of the country's worst cases of serial filicide. Born Kathleen Megan Britton on June 14, 1967, she married Craig Folbig and they settled in the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales where they started their family. Between 1989 and 1999, Kathleen would give birth to 4 children and tragically lose every single one of them before they reached 2 years of age. The first baby was Caleb, born on February 1, 1989, who died on February 20 at just 19 days old. Caleb had been born with a floppy larynx and breathing difficulties, but his death was initially attributed to sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS. 2 years later came Patrick on June 13, 1991, who suffered from epileptic seizures that caused airway obstruction and eventually led to his blindness before he died at 8 months old on February 13, 1993. Their third child was Sarah, born on October 14, 1992, who lived until August 30, 1993 when she died at 10 months old. Sarah's death was classified as SIDS by process of elimination since there was no obvious cause, though she had suffered from a lung infection prior to her death. The fourth and final child was Laura, born on August 7, 1997, who survived the longest of all the children before dying on March 1, 1999 at 18 months old. Laura's death became the trigger for a police investigation because the autopsy revealed myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart muscle. However, the pathologist changed his findings to undetermined when he learned about the deaths of Laura's 3 siblings. He contacted police because he believed smothering could not be ruled out as a cause of death, especially given the pattern of infant deaths in the same family. This was the first time anyone had suggested that the children might have been murdered rather than dying from natural causes. Police launched a full murder investigation into all 4 deaths on March 1, 1999, the same day Laura died. They focused on Kathleen because she had been the only adult present when each child died or had been the person to discover them deceased. In each case, her husband Craig had either been at work or asleep in another part of the house. Investigators believed this pattern was too suspicious to be coincidental. During their investigation, police discovered personal diaries that Kathleen had been keeping throughout the years when her children were alive. Several entries in these diaries seemed to suggest she might have been responsible for harming or even murdering her children. One particularly damning entry from January 1998 read, "I knew I was short-tempered and cruel sometimes to her and she left," with a bit of help referring to her daughter Sarah. Another entry that prosecutors would later use against her stated, "I often regret Caleb and Patrick, only because your life changes so much and, maybe, I'm not a person who likes change." In other entries, Kathleen wrote about having black moods and being stressed, which prosecutors interpreted as evidence of her guilt. Based largely on these diary entries and the statistical improbability of 4 children dying naturally in one family, Kathleen was arrested on April 19, 2001 and charged with murdering all 4 of her children. During her trial in 2003, prosecutors argued that Kathleen had systematically smothered each child because she couldn't cope with the stress of motherhood. They claimed her diary entries were confessions of guilt and that the statistical odds of 4 children dying naturally from SIDS in one family were astronomical. The prosecution painted her as a cold, calculating killer who used her position of trust as a mother to murder helpless infants. However, there was absolutely no physical evidence linking Kathleen to any of the deaths. No signs of injury were found on any of the children, and the case was entirely circumstantial. The defense argued that the children had died from natural causes and that Kathleen's diary entries reflected the grief and self-blame of a devastated mother, not admissions of murder. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the jury found her guilty on May 21, 2003. Kathleen was convicted of the manslaughter of Caleb, the intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm upon Patrick, and the murders of Patrick, Sarah, and Laura. She received a sentence of 40 years in prison with a non-parole period of 30 years. Throughout her trial and subsequent imprisonment, Kathleen maintained her complete innocence, insisting that all 4 children had died from natural causes. For 20 years, Kathleen remained behind bars while her supporters fought tirelessly to prove her innocence. The breakthrough came when geneticist Professor Carola Vinuesa from the Australian National University began examining the medical evidence in 2018. Vinuesa discovered that all 4 children had signs of underlying illnesses at the time of their deaths, including respiratory infections which are major causes of infant mortality. More importantly, Vinuesa's team found that Kathleen carried a rare genetic mutation called COM2G114 in a gene that produces a protein called calmodulin. This mutation affects heart function and can cause sudden cardiac death in infants, especially when they're stressed by illness or infection. When researchers tested preserved blood samples from Sarah and Laura, they discovered both daughters had inherited this deadly mutation from their mother. The sons Caleb and Patrick were found to have mutations in another gene that can cause lethal epilepsy, which explained Patrick's seizures and both boys' breathing problems. Armed with this genetic evidence, 90 eminent Australian scientists and medical professionals petitioned the New South Wales governor in March 2021 to pardon Kathleen. They demonstrated that all 4 deaths could be explained by extremely rare genetic factors rather than murder. A second judicial inquiry was launched in 2022 to re-examine the case with this new scientific evidence. On June 5, 2023, after reviewing the genetic findings, New South Wales Governor Margaret Beazley unconditionally pardoned Kathleen Folbig and she was released from prison after serving 20 years for crimes she didn't commit. The inquiry found there was reasonable doubt about her guilt for each offense and concluded she had been nothing but a caring mother to her children. On December 14, 2023, the New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal officially exonerated Kathleen by quashing all her convictions. The court called the original evidence used against her unreliable and cited the substantial body of new genetic evidence that explained her children's deaths. Kathleen Folbig's case became a landmark example of how advances in genetic science can overturn wrongful convictions and free innocent people who've been imprisoned for decades. Looking back at these 13 cases of mothers who took their children's lives, each story reveals the complex and tragic circumstances that can lead to unthinkable acts. From Amelia Dyer's Victorian-era baby farming operation that claimed hundreds of lives to modern cases like Andrea Yates's postpartum psychosis-driven bathtub drownings, these cases span different eras, countries, and circumstances but share common threads of mental illness, desperation, and systemic failures. Some mothers like Susan Smith killed for selfish reasons, drowning her sons to win back a boyfriend who didn't want children, while others like Dominique Cotres hid pregnancies and murdered newborns due to severe psychological dysfunction. The most heartbreaking aspect is that many of these tragedies could have been prevented with better mental health support, earlier intervention, or simply someone recognizing the warning signs. Cases like Juanetta Hoyt's remain controversial decades later, with modern science suggesting some convicted mothers might have been innocent victims of rare genetic disorders, as proven definitively with Kathleen Folbig's exoneration after 20 years in prison for crimes she didn't commit. These stories serve as stark reminders that behind every headline about a mother who kills lies a complicated web of mental illness, societal pressures, and human frailty that demands our understanding rather than just our condemnation.